The prison was surprisingly clean, and by late September, the stone building was even fairly warm. After all, it was relatively new. The original old jail had exploded and partially burned down a century earlier. The guards led Edward to a cell at the end of the corridor. As he walked, he counted only 6 rooms in total. This wasn't a place of final punishment. After sentencing, the condemned were transferred to the fortress of Basalt, which stood on a nearby islet. Each cell held 4 rough plank beds, barely smoothed, topped with thick but clean straw mattresses. A toilet, separated from the main area by sturdy doors, was also included. Everything looked far better than Edward had expected. He didn't know that this was thanks to the guard commander, who had an almost obsessive fear of lice, fleas, and rats, and thus made sure the prisoners regularly scrubbed every corner and washed anything that could be laundered. He learned this the very next morning, when one of the soldiers brusquely inspected his head and ordered his hair cut much shorter than was customary at the time. He also had to strip almost naked so the soldier could make sure there was nothing on his skin requiring a doctor's attention. While most cells were full, Edward was, for now, imprisoned alone. This allowed him to pray without disturbance. Each cell even had a Bible, but the small windows high in the walls let in little light, so he only opened it briefly around noon when it was brightest. The entire day passed uneventfully. He received food twice daily, around 10, a thick slice of bread with watery soup, after 4, a hearty dish of potatoes and vegetables. It wasn't bad at all. Edward spent 2 nights in the prison before they brought in a cellmate. He tried to strike up a conversation, but they had barely introduced themselves when a grim-faced lawyer, whom Edward recognized from church, appeared at the bars. "The pastor sent me," the lawyer began bluntly. "But you should know I have no intention of taking on a case like this. I had no idea you were accused of treason against the monarchy, and I'm not getting mixed up in that. Since I'm here, though, I'll give you some information. Do you realize how serious this accusation is?" Edward shook his head silently. "There are 2 possible punishments," the lawyer said, his frown deepening. "The first is a public flogging. They'll whip you until the flesh hangs off your back, followed by exile. And you should know that's the milder option," he warned. "I'm not one to beat around the bush, so I'll be straight with you. The second option is the ultimate penalty." "How could you even think of defying the king's orders?" "I felt I had to help the rector," Edward replied quietly. "And I'm certain God led me to do it." The lawyer rolled his eyes. "I've heard that kind of talk before, nonsense, excuses. And I strongly advise you to keep such things to yourself in court. You defied the king's will, and the best thing you can do now is admit your guilt. If you had the guts to go against the king's command, then stand up like a man and face the consequences. Don't blame your grandmother, or some distant aunt's bad influence, and certainly not God, who commanded us to submit to the authorities. Your stupidity and disobedience to God's ordinances have landed you in a hopeless situation. If you spout this nonsense in court, the executioner will soon make sure you answer to the ultimate judge." Edward smiled. "I know how it looks from a human perspective. You might have said something similar to Moses when he stood before the Red Sea. His situation looked hopeless too, and he, in his own way, stood against the authorities of his time. I don't believe God always calls us to slavish obedience to every ruler. In the 15 years I've followed God, I've come to know his voice, and when the cell door closed behind me, he told me not to fear, that nothing would happen to me, and that I should use these few weeks in prison to preach to anyone willing to listen." "Your trial won't take weeks," the lawyer growled. "It's set for next Thursday. And if you tell those fairy tales in court, you'll be swinging from the gallows in a matter of days." "I thought I was speaking to a brother from the same church," Edward said, slightly puzzled. "You know the pastor sometimes lets me preach. Don't you believe I know what I'm talking about?" "Clearly, you don't believe me when I say I know what I'm talking about," the lawyer shot back. The lawyer looked increasingly angry, and Edward tried to respond as gently as possible. "I understand how this must look from a human point of view. But when God says something, it happens. You can't walk on water either, until Jesus says, 'Come.' You know, I had an incredibly vivid dream last night, and I know it wasn't just my imagination. It was something God showed me. The lawyer eyed Edward skeptically, but curiosity got the better of him, and he let him continue. It was almost like a vision, Edward began. An incredibly detailed scene I can still see clearly. I saw several people standing in the corner of a beautiful large garden surrounding a grand country house with a strange octagonal tower. They were gathered around an open grave with a lowered coffin. An old man stood over the grave, leaning on a cane, tears streaming down his face. He was unbelievably frail. I don't think I've ever seen someone so old and wrinkled. I can't say if he was 90 or 100, but certainly not less. Yet he looked lively, and when he later took a few steps, I was surprised by how lightly he moved for such an old man. None of the clumsiness you often see in the elderly. There were several other people there, one of whom might have been around 60. He had graying hair and looked strikingly like me. I studied him for a brief moment and thought he was an older version of myself. There were also some women, his sisters, and one quietly said to him, "Richard, it seems Father isn't able to speak. Maybe you should take over." Richard cleared his throat, about to say something. At that moment, the old man raised his head, looked around at the others, and smiled at Richard. "You may share a name with King Richard the Lionheart," he said, "but please save your speech for my funeral. Trust me, this old lion still has enough strength to speak. In my life, I've done many things, but above all, I've always been a preacher. And at this funeral, I'll be the one preaching." He reached into his pocket for a handkerchief and wiped his tears. "These aren't tears of sorrow but of emotion and gratitude," he continued. "Your mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother has gone to a place we can only dream of for now. We spent so many years together, more than most couples ever do. And in all those years, so much happened that, for me, nothing is more real than God. No rock is as solid as His word. I've learned that when God says go, it's wise to go. When He says nothing will happen to you, nothing will. When He says speak, you'd better not stay silent. Sometimes we don't know what lies ahead. But if we have the courage to follow God into situations that seem unusual or even dangerous, new doors can open, doors we never knew were there. That's how great stories are made. People around the world still tell of how God parted the Red Sea, saved people from fire or from lions, but those stories didn't come from people sitting at home, too scared to step outside. They came from people who knew that if God leads them somewhere, they can follow boldly, and He can do great things. That's how it's been in my life. And the light I've carried all my life like a torch must not go out when I, soon enough, join your mother and grandmother in that place," he said firmly, not even glancing at the coffin in the freshly dug earth. Instead, he looked to the heavens and smiled. "This torch is for you to take and carry forward." Edward smiled. I didn't wake up as the vision faded. It was more like a window closed before me, and I wasn't allowed to listen to the old man any longer. His words were a true encouragement. He had something of what I'm experiencing now, but on a much greater scale. There was quiet wisdom in him, depth of experience, determination, and unquenchable fire. I wished I could keep listening, learn from him, talk to him for hours. But that man isn't someone I could meet. He's someone I'm meant to become. It took me a moment to realize that the incredibly old man was me. The lawyer raised an eyebrow but, this time, didn't argue. "I hope you're right," he said quietly. "But it'll take a real miracle for you to walk out of here alive. Don't be upset with me for not wanting to help you on this path. Still, I can think of someone else who might have the courage to take a case like yours. You should know that only a lawyer or a pastor can visit you here. As a traitor, you're forbidden to receive any other visitors, no friends, no family. Is there anything you need, or any message you want me to pass on?" Edward shook his head silently, then added, "If I could speak with the pastor, I'd be grateful." The lawyer nodded and left. Edward sat thoughtfully on his bed, gazing toward the heavens. He felt a bit sorry to have lost his privacy. At a moment like this, he wished he could pray undisturbed. But then his cellmate spoke up and asked, "How can someone become what you're talking about?"